What's good, everybody? Welcome to Origin Story, the podcast that interviews creators about where they came from to understand how they got here. My name is Phillip Russell, and I'm with my co-host,
Ben Thorp.
Ben Thorp. It has been a minute, but we are back again with another conversation, this time with author Christine Lai, and we talked to her about her debut novel, Landscapes, from our friends $2 Radio.
That's right, folks. We've gone back from playing video games that are basically novels to just reading novels. We're back to our roots.
Back to our roots once again. This conversation covers the novel writ large. We get into art and the purpose of art in apocalypses, amongst many other things. I think that we'll just let this conversation speak for itself. And as always, we will talk a little bit more about what we thought of the conversation and the outro. So tune in. Christine Lai grew up in Canada and lived in England for 6 years during graduate studies. She holds a PhD in English literature from University College London, and her debut novel Landscapes was shortlisted for the inaugural Novel Prize. Christine currently lives in Vancouver, BC. Christine, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so Landscapes, it's your debut novel. From what I understand, it was published earlier this year in Canada and is coming out this month in September in the US. Next week. I'm curious just like how you're feeling about the book kind of being out. I guess it's been out for a little bit of time, but like how's that feeling been? How's that process been?
It's been quite kind of anxiety inducing. I'm very excited. So it's just, yeah, it's a mix of different kinds of feelings. You know, it's obviously very, it's a very exciting and wonderful opportunity to have a debut novel out. But at the same time, I'm quite anxious about, I guess, just reception, because it used to be this very private thing. And then I started sharing it with industry professionals. I think that's a bit different, sharing with editors and agents, but sharing, I think, with general readers, I think that's a different level of, I don't know, it feels like a kind of exposure. I'm excited to hear what people think, but at the same time, I'm also very wary of what they might say. So I'm trying to just stay off social media as much as I can. I think it's just best not to kind of dwell too much on these things. The Canadian launch did give me a bit of experience with that entire process. But because it's like my first time doing this, it was a bit scary. So hopefully with the US launch, I will have had this experience and it'll just be a bit smoother. So we'll see how it goes. Hopefully it won't be too terrible.
You know, we've talked to I think folks who are at all different places in their publishing. You know, people who are like, oh, this is my debut novel. A couple of people who are like, I have published many novels, and this is how I got over that hump. And I'm wondering how you were kind of thinking about leading into this moment where you're launching a debut. It's finally going to be seen by people, and was there some kind of practice where you're like, here's what I'm going to do, here's how I'm going to kind of protect myself as I like put this out into the world?
I guess I think just focusing on the work itself. Like a friend of mine gave me really great advice. Start the next book before the first book is out, so that you have something that you're focused on, that you're passionate about, so that whatever happens with this book, good or bad, you will already have something that you're kind of devoted to. So I did do that, and I think that has helped. So most of the time I'm actually thinking about the next book, and even though I can't, I guess I haven't like really shared that with anyone, but so it just seems like it's completely mine. It's very private. So I like that feeling. And I think just like reading, just focusing on books that I love, writers that I love, and just being in that kind of space of literature. So I think that that's helped a lot, and having supportive writer friends, that makes a big difference. Just because I think, like I said, a lot of people have gone through it. A lot of people feel very anxious about this whole process. So it's good to know that I'm not alone in this boat. Yeah, and yes, staying off and not reading. I don't read like Amazon Goodreads or things like that. Sometimes people do tag me on Instagram, so I might see that. But aside from that, like I don't go seeking for those type of reviews. I think professional like critics, those reviews are a bit different. So I think that I do read those, and if they do have critiques, it might be useful to know what the critiques are. Yeah, but I think just it's best to kind of minimize the amount of exposure I have to like readers' opinions.
Yeah, I mean, I was like immediately drawn into landscapes. Like, we've had a number of authors who've been published on $2 Radio in the past. So like, I'm constantly looking on that website and like seeing whatever new things are coming along. So when I saw landscapes, I mean, right from the cover alone, I was like, whoa, what is this? And then learning that it kind of had a climate change, post-apocalyptic kind of setting is another, just like, that's just popcorn for Ben and I, because we're super interested in climate change related topics, and especially like post-apocalyptic kind of backdrops for novels that aren't necessarily focused on like surviving in like zombie apocalypses and stuff like that. The first thing that stood out to me about Landscapes is that for such a kind of small novel, it's like a little over 200 pages, there's so much happening in it. It's kind of like epistolary, journal entry kind of stuff happening. There's archival descriptions. There's art criticism. There's even like kind of more traditional like third person point of view sections. And I'm curious, like maybe just to set us up, how do you describe the novel? Like, if you had to give somebody an elevator pitch about what Landscapes is, how might you describe it? And I'll just take the heat off me for a second.
It was definitely challenging to pitch it when I first finished the manuscript, and I had to send it to agents and later to editors. It was definitely a challenge to try to kind of encapsulate in a single sentence, in like the elevator pitch. I guess I would say it's a hybrid text that blends diary, art essays, and a more traditional linear third person narrative. That's that I think is the easiest ways to describe it. But that it approaches the themes of like memory and healing from different angles. So hence all the different types of writing that are in the book. So I guess I was kind of overly ambitious. I wasn't sure if I would get a chance to write another book, or if I would want to write another book. So I wanted to like pack a lot in the first book. I thought this might be my only chance to write a novel. So so I packed a lot in there. And I wanted to just create something that was kind of multi-layered, because I tend to be drawn to texts that are hybrid, that are playing with form, and that kind of combine different things. So I just wanted to kind of follow in that tradition.
One of the things that I think, like, especially, early on, I was really sucked into this book, and is that I think it's like dealing with this question of what is the permanence of art, and how does it stick around, and how does it continue to resonate or not. And I think that fits so well with this backdrop of there's a lot of these climate disasters, and I think there's this kind of open question of what does it mean to like make art and engage with art in a world that is maybe collapsing and maybe going away. And maybe you could just talk about like, those questions and how you were drawn to them.
Yeah, I mean, it's a question that I ask myself a lot, you know, and I think a lot of people who've chosen to go into the arts might have similar concerns. You know, what is the use of what we do essentially? Like how effective could art be when it comes to contributing to some sort of positive change in the world? Um, and I don't really have like an easy answer to that. But I think it's important to keep asking these questions. I think in many ways, the process of making art is a way of bearing witness to everything that's happening, and certainly I mean I didn't set out to write so directly about the ecological crisis. It was something that just kind of happened somewhere during the process, because I was watching the news or reading the news and watching all of these things happening in the world, and it just seemed quite sudden. Like I think I would say, like in the past couple of years, there's just like these events have increased exponentially, and it just became impossible to ignore. And there were also more articles, I think, just in magazines and journals about the climate crisis. So I feel like it just really came to the forefront of cultural discourse. And I also read Amitav Ghosh's The Great Derangement.
Great book. Let's
Yeah,
go.
such a great book. It's so fantastic. He's absolutely right. Like, you know, fiction hasn't really addressed the climate crisis enough, and so I felt like I wanted to include that as a way of I guess challenging myself to see if I could address it while also looking at all of these other aspects. Yeah.
Okay, now I'm forced to ask you. I think one of the theses of Great Derangement is this idea of like, you know, particularly I think the idea of like the American novel is really obsessed with the interior, and that makes it impossible in some ways to deal with like calamity that is, you know, far beyond. How did you think about that when you were like, I'm writing this book and I want in some ways to like address and engage with, you know, climate change?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure I fully agreed with his argument, because I feel like,
all right.
yeah, I feel like the I can't remember the term. He's like the bourgeois novel. I think it could definitely incorporate a lot more than just kind of the interior life of the individual, and I think it's important to acknowledge, like, I guess the connectedness between the individual and kind of the wider world, and the porousness, and the way that we are influenced by our environment, and vice versa. So it's not something that's completely closed off. But yeah, I remember he made his argument about time, about how it's very difficult for you know, the novel, which is set in a particular time, very limited time frame of that's defined by human life, and it's very difficult for the novel to address planetary time or geological time. And I think that is true, and that's like that is something that's very challenging, just because it's hard for us as individuals to really see that. So yeah, so I mean, I think it's a fascinating topic, and I'm also always looking at novels that address not necessarily just the climate crisis, but any kind of catastrophe, you know, like how novels represent something that really seems to push representation to its limits.
Yeah, I mean, something that I really appreciated in the novel, you know, was the form, because, you know, I come from a more creative nonfiction background, and I really like collage-based works and kind of stranger kind of formal choices made in narrative. And something that kind of strikes me that I didn't really think about too heavily while reading the book, but just as we're talking, is like Penelope, the main character. She's like a librarian archivist kind of background, and her story largely is told in like these journal entries that in turn are going to we can imagine are going to become parts of like a potential archive one day. And I'm curious like how you landed on the form for this novel, Was it always like in these kind of journal entries specifically that section of it, or did you land on that maybe after experimenting with other parts of the novel?
Yeah, so I started with Penelope's sections first, and the very, very early drafts, it was actually just a third person narrative. And then I felt like something was amiss. So you're right. So I experimented with different voices, different perspective, and I felt like this is what it makes most sense. It was like a good fit for the character. And also, I love epistolary novels or novels written in diary form, and I love like the fragmentariness and the way that they allow a character to speak. And I recently read The Forbidden Notebook by the Italian writer Alba de Cespedes, I think. I might be mispronouncing that. And June Palahiri wrote a great introduction for the novel. And she talked about how like diary novels are kind of like documents of a character self-fashioning. So we get to see the character struggle in a very direct way. And we get to hear their voice and the way that they kind of see the world. And it's unfiltered, as it were. And I like how a lot of diary novels, they retain a kind of like imperfection, I guess. So because it's meant to be or mimic someone's notebook, it has to kind of be a bit unpolished. And so I like that aspect as well. Yeah, it kind of resists the perfection that's often demanded of novels.
Thinking about after I finished the novel, I loved this kind of tension that you had between showcasing decay next to beauty, death next to life, possibility in destruction. I feel like these are all kinds of things that we're seeing from the setting in Mornington to how Penelope is kind of archiving different works and cataloging postcards and paintings and everything else. It kind of reminded me a bit of I like to take photos in my spare time, and I really like street photography and or like life photography, as some people say it. And a photographer I enjoy always says that whenever they take a picture, that's them saying yes. And in some ways, I kind of felt that with Penelope's character throughout the novel. Like, you get these moments of her saying yes, this is an important moment for me. This is an important moment of art, and then obviously there's kind of like a big underlying moment in her life that she's kind of working throughout the entirety of the novel. But I mean, I don't really have a question here. I just felt that you did a really good job of kind of showing like the fluidity in terms of how we engage with art and how art engages with our lives, and I think that the forum really does a really good job of kind of showcasing all that friction and tension that's happening.
I like that quote. Taking a photograph as a way of saying yes. Yeah. And yeah, I do think that, the art continues to play a role. To go back to your earlier question about art in kind of dying world and what art means. I mean, I think that it does and will continue to play a role in people's daily lives, as perhaps a source of consolation. But yeah, I'm wary of being too nostalgic, maybe, because it's easy like look back on the days when art played a more central role in culture. But yeah, and I think that despite all these kind of I guess fears about like AI and new developments, I do think that writing will continue to play a role in society. So Penelope writing in the diary and writing as a way of like finding a path out of despair. That was a very important part of the book for me. Yeah, so I didn't want it to be too depressing at the end. I think that bit of hope that at the end is important.
We get a lot of different relationships to art throughout landscapes, and there's, I think, this idea of the archive, where our memories of art are preserved in some ways and not really interacted with. But there are also items throughout the novel that feel like they capture memory and experience in a way that is really similar to the paintings that you describe throughout the novel. I'm thinking about how Penelope kind of hangs on to some of the mementos from her father after he dies. And for me, there's this suggestion that art is ultimately like hyper personal and in some ways has to be interacted with, but that interaction also is going to like lead to the decay of some of those physical items and renders this stuff impermanent. Can you maybe talk to me about that, you know, in some ways juxtaposition there?
That's a really interesting point. Yeah, I do think that for Penelope, art is deeply personal. And, you know, she uses art as a way of mapping her life experiences. But yeah, I actually hadn't thought about what. Yes, so the impermanence of the object. So a lot of these, I call them the archive items, like the books and you know the objects and sometimes like just photographs that she is archiving. A lot of they're in kind of fragile conditions, and a lot of them have been damaged by pests, by flood. So I think that I wanted to highlight the impermanence of the fragility and the precarity of these material objects. And so none of them are really meant to last. But nevertheless, there is this drive to preserve them for as long as possible. And the meaning that we derive from them, in some ways, you know, does not depend on the physical object. So the object can cease to exist, like the painting could be lost, could be stolen, but what it imparts remains with the person who's truly engaged with the object or work of art, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's a great passage. The thing that was kind of teeing me off to think about this is there's this bit where the character Alex is reading Penelope's books and she's getting really agitated because he's like, the way that he's reading them is like fraying them. And I assume he's dog-earing them. And so it's like, he's engaging with it, but it's like in a way that is like, you can tell that it's fraying and decaying. And so I was just thinking about like the way that sometimes the archive is set up to be like a thing that it exists, we're preserving the art, but maybe you can't like really engage with it or like touch it, because if you do, it's like degrading it in some ways, and then it won't be accessible to like the future.
That's a very good point. Yeah. I guess like a lot of these, well, maybe not in the world of novel, but in the real world, I mean, a lot of these artworks, you know, they are just sitting in vaults and in archives and storage space. They're not actually being viewed or studied. So because they're very precious. And I was interested in the idea of like, you know, the value of an artwork. And because one of the early inspiration for the book was when I came across one of Turner's paintings that was sold by Sotheby's in like 2017 for like 18 million pounds. And there was, and so it's now in a private collection and will never be viewed publicly again. And I went on their website and they had like the provenance of the painting, all the grand estates in which the painting was once housed. So I became interested in this idea of like the artwork as possession, as a form of capital, and not just a thing of beauty. So it's something that has monetary value. And for a lot of collectors, or for someone like Julian, that is the only value that they might see. And so I think it's you know, it's entangled with with capitalism and with idea of like private property, and that kind of preserving, you know, putting it in the vault, making sure it's protected, and not engaging with it. It leads to I think another kind of decay, another kind of forgetting, maybe, in a way that is juxtaposed to how Penelope engages with art in a very kind of, I suppose, hands-on, very direct fashion.
Yeah, I mean the art kind of criticism essays or like kind of interludes that happen throughout the novel, I think really speak to that, because something I was ruminating on, you know, before hopping on is just that the novel does a really good job of like showing the power choosing what we decide to be valuable. And in this case, art is kind of the big thing that the novel is grappling with, and how that kind of sheds light on what we as a society choose to champion. And I think something that the art criticism essays, really are exploring is kind of this juxtaposition between beauty and sexual violence against women, largely, and how a lot of these, the kind of old great artists like sculptures and paintings are depicting, really intense moments of rape and violence against women, but they're often, not talked about or acknowledged in that fashion. And instead, it's like talking about how beautiful they are. And I'm just curious, like, I mean, this is kind of a big question, but I mean, what do you think that says about, us as a society, that we're kind of stuck in the, I think there's a lot of change happening now, but we've kind of been stuck in this mode of championing sexual violence in art against women, without acknowledging the actual context through which what's happening on the page is happening.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such an important subject, and when I started doing the research, it was really eye-opening to me. I mean, I've seen a lot of these artworks in person, in various museums and galleries, and I don't recall being, I guess, educated about that context within the space of the museum. So these art historians have really done just a tremendous job doing this research and just kind of raising awareness. And yeah, I was really interested in how, like I said, we collectively kind of define something as beautiful without looking at these kind of historical and cultural context and the subject of violence that underpins all of these artworks. And I do think that there needs to be like recontextualizing, like we need to look at these artworks anew. That doesn't mean that they cease to be beautiful. I think that that's the issue that a lot of people might have. And I remember reading Catherine McCormack's Women in the Picture, and it's such a fantastic book about the subject, and she talks about how when she's making presentations or giving talks about the subject, a lot of people are kind of resistant. They almost see it as a form of like sacrilege because it's high art and we shouldn't question Titian. Because I remember talking to an acquaintance about the Titian, and they're just like, well, why would you want to point out something like that in a painting? Because it's beautiful. And I'll say, but it doesn't cease to be aesthetically pleasing just because we're pointing out this aspect of the painting. I actually think it makes it more interesting. It kind of enriches our experience of the artwork. But I do think that there is this kind of resistance. Maybe people just want something that's, I don't know, uncomplicated. That's more about the pleasure of viewing a work of art. And I think the same extends to like the country houses. So I think it was 2020, maybe, the National Trust in England, they published a report about the links to slavery in a lot of the houses that's under their care. And a lot of people didn't like that. A lot of conservative people didn't like that because they felt like, well, you're ruining the experience of going to these beautiful places for afternoon tea or strolling the garden. And I don't know to what extent that their campaign to kind of raise awareness was successful. Because I've spoken to friends about it, and people are just like, well, why would I want to know about that? If I just want to, go for a nice afternoon, I just want to have, a relaxing time. So yeah, I do think that it's these separate situations say something quite dark maybe about culture and our lack of willingness to face what happened in the past and to make changes. And we see that in different contexts as well. And Yeah, but I do think it is changing. I know that there are more museums and galleries that are, educating the public about the nature of certain artworks just through, the labels on the wall, something simple like that, or through their like audio guides and their tours and things like that. So I think, yeah, if there were more of that type of information, then yeah, I think that more people would just be aware, and we would kind of question our own preferences as spectators or as visitors to various places.
I had maybe like a broader question, which is like, what is your own relationship to art, and like how you, I think you're kind of already talking about it, like how you engage with a piece of work and how you're kind of thinking about it. But like, yeah, what role does art play in your life, and in what ways are you kind of finding it and seeking it out and engaging with it?
Well, I don't have a background in art history. I think if I had to choose again, I might choose art. I Yeah, so I don't do any art personally. I take photographs. So I'm really into photography at the moment. And when it comes to writing, I feel like I always need to start with visual arts. Pretty much all the projects I've worked on, including like short stories and essays, always start with either an artist or just a single image. Yeah, I find it's like a springboard for all kinds of ideas. And there's this great line from Orhan Pamuk's The Naive and Sentimental Novelist, where he talks about how novelists are like secretly envious of painters, because writing always begins with visualization. So we visualize the setting or the space in which the character lives, and then we translate that into words. But it doesn't. But language will never have that directness that the visual arts have. So I think I do feel a sense of not exactly envy, but I wish that I had the skills and the way of capturing the world that a visual artist has. And I find a lot, reading about artists and their process very inspiring. Even though writing is very different, but I find this, yeah, a lot of like I guess like their dedication and the repetitiveness, and there's this kind of like ritualistic approach that some artists have when it comes to kind of going to the studio and setting everything up. So I find that just very inspiring.
Phil and I kind of were talking throughout about, I think there will be sections where you're describing a painting to us. Mm-hmm. And I would frequently like pull up Google and just like look it up. But yeah, talk to me about, I think there was a conscious decision not to put some of those pieces of art in the novel. Why?
Mostly because of copyright reasons.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I think that's quite complicated, like using images in a book. And also the central painting of You and the Seine doesn't actually exist. It's based on a real painting. Because I remember when I first submitted the manuscript, one of my editors was like Googling for ages, like, what does this painting look like? I was like, it doesn't really exist. So I wanted to create something that was a kind of fictional Turner, but all the other Turners are real. And yeah, so it's, yeah, I went to look at a lot of these in person, or just always on the internet looking at art and paintings.
Yeah, I assume that Turner's work is specifically of interest to you, given that it's such a central part of the novel. I'm curious, like, what is it maybe about Turner's work that has drawn you in so much, or why was their work such an important aspect for this particular novel?
That's an interesting question. I studied Turner during graduate school, so he was part of my thesis, and so I think it just kind of is something that kind of just developed as I was reading about the era in which he lived, and because he was such an important artist in English history. But I've always been drawn to the paintings, and it's kind of hard to articulate. And Penelope's kind of struggles with describing art is very much something that I've experienced, which is this, it's something that really just that is so appealing and so mesmerizing, but it's hard to kind of pinpoint the exact quality. Um, I suppose it's his use of light, that the you know his I got a print in front of me right now. The sunlight, it really just makes you feel like you're bathed in real light. And he was such a pioneer in that kind of painting technique, and the Impressionists were so indebted to him. But he's not. I don't think he's like as widely known as someone like Monet. Yeah, and I liked reading about his biography, the fact that he grew up in behind the cabbage stalls of Covent Garden, as John Berger wrote in his essay about Turner, and became one of the most successful artists. And so he had a very interesting life, and was quite a strange person. I don't know if you watched that movie, Mr. Turner, the Mike Leigh film from a couple of years ago.
I have not, but I was Googling the paintings in the background here, and the actor's face was like one of the third or fourth things that came up, and I was like, what?
Yeah, it's good. He did a really good job. I think Timothy Spall is the actor.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, I think he did a good job of portraying Turner as someone who's just bad-tempered, a bit rude, and so it's his paintings and like who he was. There's don't seem to match, but yeah, I just found him fascinating as a person.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't too familiar with his work before reading the book, so yeah, like Ben said, I was like looking up a lot of the paintings as I was going through, and I agree. Like his paintings are kind of immediately enticing. I feel like I'm kind of entering into a memory or something like that. I think a unique tension that we see in the book is like Penelope's relationship to Turner, and this kind of immense fluidity between time and space that thinking about these paintings has on her. There's times where it kind of allows her to place herself back into a moment, but then there's also times where we almost get like this superimposed feeling of like it's in the present, but we're kind of seeing somewhere in the future or maybe somewhere in the past, and we're kind of seeing this layering happening. I was wondering if maybe you could just talk a little bit about that with art, and how art kind of gives us the capacity to maybe linger in stasis, but also to imagine otherwise, or like imagine something different, which I think is where the novel ultimately kind of ends. If you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, she has these. There are these kind of like kind of ekphrastic moments where she imagines a given scene in a painting, and I think that, like you said, the process of imagining, of placing ourselves in a different context was very important, especially for the Penelope as a character, because I think one of the main sort of I guess struggles that this character had was what to do in the face of all this catastrophe. Like, how do we place ourselves in someone else's shoes? How do we see from their perspective? So the act of looking at an artwork is in some ways linked to the act of seeing through someone else's eyes. So it's that a similar process of removing ourselves from our own context and placing ourselves somewhere else. So hence her empathy and her drive to help others. It is linked to a particular way of looking at anything outside the self. And so and that was something that I added, like that layer was something that I added kind of later in the writing process, when I felt like there was something that was missing in terms of her relationship to the world. And I didn't want her to be kind of like solipsistic, locked in in a room just looking at art. So I wanted there to be a link to the world. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, that's great. I mean, I love it when, writers we talk to, they talk a little bit about when these kinds of moments happen in the process of writing a novel. Like we talked to Jess Stincy, who wrote My Volcano from 2 Hour Radio, and they talked a lot about, like, there's one aspect in that book that is so pivotal to the whole thing, and they're like, oh yeah, I wrote that like a month before. And so it's always interesting to kind of hear that kind of process. And I think in that token, I was curious about the sections with Julian and kind of the choice to kind of embody his story. And I'm trying to like not talk too spoilery, but like I'm just curious about that element of the novel. Like how long in did you consider that, and kind of what were you hoping to explore in those sections?
Yeah, so I decided fairly early on that I was going to write from his perspective, but the original kind of structure was, the book was going to be cut in half. The first half was going to be Penelope with, a few chapters told from his perspective. So it was later on that I decided to kind of intersperse them. So there's this kind of back and forth, and it's mainly because I wanted to juxtapose their approaches. And their personalities, the way that they approach art, the way that they relate to others in the world, and because Penelope is fairly stationary throughout most of the book. She stays in the house with some excursions to the city, whereas he is constantly in movement. But there is this kind of psychological stasis in him in Julian as a character. So I wanted to juxtapose them in that sense as well. And I was really inspired by Teju Pole's Open City, which is one of my favorite novels ever. And that features, a male narrator wandering through the city or cities, various cities, and in the process trying to like evade his own past. So I was very influenced by that, and I kind of wanted to pay homage to that book by writing from the perspective of someone who might be considered monstrous, but not to kind of make excuses for him, but to really just kind of, I was curious about like the psychology of someone like that. And it's interesting hearing from some readers who told me that they just felt like it was too much. They didn't want to learn about someone who was like that. But I don't know, maybe I'm just I find it fascinating. When I was an undergrad, I wanted to become a forensic psychologist. So there's a bit of that left in me, because I just, I think it's it's someone who is very, very different. And it was a challenge for me to imagine what goes on in the mind of someone who's very different from myself, from anyone I've ever met. And it was hard in that it's a character who's kind of opaque to himself. And so it was challenging for me to portray that opacity, while at the same time, obviously, being able to see from a kind of authorial point of view. But yeah, I mean, I hope that it worked, that kind of contrast.
You were kind of talking before about putting yourself inside of the art, or finding a way to like engage with an art where it's like you end up inside of it. And I underlined one of the passages, and I'm wondering if there's a suggestion here that like art is also a way to kind of process what has happened, and that like through like viewing and then embodying these artworks, it's a way to like move through these experiences in your own life. And if that's something that kind of Penelope is using as a way to kind of help process some of her kind of trauma.
Yes. No, absolutely. I mean, it's for Penelope, that's kind of what I was suggesting, is that the artworks become kind of prisms for her own feelings. And to go back to our earlier points, art is deeply personal, and these meanings that she invests in them are meanings that come out of her trauma, her experiences, and yeah, I mean, I don't know to what extent this is a very common way of relating to art. I I personally don't necessarily do that with
Mm-hmm.
art. I think that my relationship to art it remains very kind of on an aesthetic plane, and it's more about how I could learn from the artwork and use those ideas in my own creative process. So it's more about that rather than what a particular artwork might say to me about something I'm going through or have gone through. Yeah. But my sense is just like looking at, especially on social media when people comment on their visits to various museums. I do think that for a lot of people it is very personal, and that it's particular artworks might be linked to a particular phase in life, much like how music is, or any other cultural products that we consume. We associate something with a particular phase in life or a particular place that we lived in, and that always becomes attached to that time. Yeah.
Hmm. You know, this is kind of a selfish question, but thinking about process again, as somebody who's never written to completion a novel, let alone one that has a huge epistolary component, I'm always curious when I read those kinds of works. Like, what is the actual process like for you in terms of developing that narrative for Penelope through the journal entries? Was it something that maybe just like ritualistically every day you sat down and wrote one, or did you kind of have an idea of like start to finish what you were hoping to do and you kind of filled it in?
No, it was definitely not every day. So during the process of writing this book, I was working full time at the time, and it was just very difficult to write. So I would maybe have one weekend free per month. So
Hmm.
the writing was very sporadic,
Wow.
and then I would have some time during the summer and during Christmas, during holidays, when I could work on it for a bit longer. But again, it was there will be like stretches of like weeks when I didn't work on it. So actually, the fragmentary form made it a bit easier because it just meant that if I had time, I could write however many hundreds of words that I needed for that section, and something that's a lot longer, and that required just a longer period of time. Yeah, and there was a lot of going back and forth, a lot of cutting. So I cut quite a lot before the book was even submitted to agents. So I always like overwrite beyond the limit, and then I cut back. And I actually think that for me, that's been the most effective in terms of just polishing the text and getting rid of anything that's extraneous. So there were a lot more like archive items that I had originally
Hmm.
included, or more like artworks that were referenced. So I just cut anything that felt was repetitive, or that was maybe too tangential, because I didn't want a very big book. So I wanted to aim for something that's a bit compact, because I personally like slimmer books.
Same.
Same, baby.
Yeah, they were just it's nice to just be able to finish something in a few sittings.
Hmm.
Yeah, so yeah, so I think that it, it, I don't know, for the next project I would like to maybe try working on it for a longer period of time at once. Curious to see how different that would be and what the end product would look like. Yeah.
Are you able to talk at all about like what is the editing process like when you have a novel and you're like, I'm ready? Like, how much back and forth is there as you're like cutting and making decisions about what to keep?
There was a lot of back and forth. So with the agent who signed these contracts, or got these contracts for me, she did one or two rounds of edits before it was out on submission. Yeah, even before any editor saw it, it was already being edited. And then the substantive edits, that was the most intense period of, I think, 6 months, maybe something like that,
Hmm.
of a lot of back and forth. And because I had two editors, so with my Canadian editor, so that contract was a bit earlier. So we did the substantive edits first, and then we signed with $2 Radio. So then I did edits with Eric. So that was a bit challenging because there were two separate
Wow.
different timelines as well, just so they
Yeah.
were overlapping a bit. So yeah, so that was quite intense.
What happens? Was there ever a case where like, $2 would be like, we want this cut, and then like, your Canadian editor would be like, no, that part's great, we're leaving that in.
There were some not necessarily disagreements, but people notice different things, or they have different suggestions for maybe the same section of the same problem. And I had to choose which one I thought made more sense for the book. Yeah, but there weren't like, like debates or anything like that.
Okay.
And I think it was really good to get different sets of eyes on the manuscript, and people do notice different things, or have different preferences. So that was a very insightful process. Like that was my favorite part, really, the editing, and then the copy editing as well. Eliza is the best copy editor, and yeah, so she was so meticulous, and the text is so much stronger now because of her work. So I enjoyed that as well. All of that was very tiring, and there was a lot of back and forth, but I think it was worth it. Yeah, so personally, I like working with an editor versus like workshopping. So I did do like a continuing education program in 2016. So that was when I first started doing creative writing, and there was the workshopping, and that model just didn't really work that well for me, because you're listening to the opinions of like 10 people, and so and there are a lot of like differences in opinions, so it was very difficult to reconcile the opinions of 10 people. So working with an editor one-on-one, it's much easier because you're listening to one person and you're corresponding and having this dialogue about the work, versus in a workshop where I couldn't really say anything. I just had to receive the feedback. Yeah, so it was it was really rewarding to me.
Do you mind talking just a little bit about like the practice of writing and how it how it fits into your life? I think Phil and I are always talking about like working day jobs and then finding time and space afterwards. I think you're talking about like the weekend situation. Like, what does it look like for you now?
So I'm not actually working at the moment. So it is like, well, my dream job is to be able to work, to write full time. And I've spoken to other writers about it, and some people actually don't like writing full time because they feel like it's you have the entire day and it feels very unstructured. So I try to treat it like a day job. So it's like a kind of 9 to 5 sort of thing for me, where or usually I would start early, like maybe like 8 to 4. So I would make sure that I clock in a certain number of hours at the desk, and it's not just like writing. I count reading or doing research as part of that process as well. So it's basically pretty much every day, with the exception of like weekends or holidays and so on. And so I think I try to not yeah, I guess it is kind of ritualistic. Like I would have like certain steps. I'd always make my tea first, and have everything set up, and then I start, and it just makes it feel easier to get into it. And I avoid going on the internet. Yeah, so there are things I have to do to kind of force myself to focus. And I find that this is the most productive. I felt that working sporadically on the weekends, that was quite hard, just because it takes some time to get back in track, get back into the atmosphere of the book. But yeah, I mean, I think when I do work full time again, I probably would still do the same like weekends, because I find that after work, some people do it before work, which I really admire. Yeah, maybe if I woke up at 5, I would be able to do it.
I was curious during, because I know you have a PhD. I was curious, like, just from my personal experience reading the novel, I felt a lot of just how should I put it? Like, yeah, I did 2 master's programs. Ben has done a master's in creative writing, and I think like we both have had a lot of conversations about like you get out, and in some ways it kind of feels like a climate apocalypse. Like you're like, what do I do with this thing I spent years with, and like nobody really wants to, engage with it in the same fashion that the really curated experience that I had in school did. I felt like in some ways, maybe inadvertently, like landscapes also has like a little bit of an interest in exploring that. And I think you, at the top of the show, you talked a little bit about people who choose to like devote their lives to the arts or like studying the art, and how after the fact, you're kind of you kind of have to answer these questions for yourself about like, what do I do with this stuff? Yeah, I don't really know if there's a question there, but it just felt like there was a vibe.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's, I'm sure, maybe our experiences have been similar. It's that sense of being unmoored,
Mm-hmm.
the institution was this kind of like harbor, right? And then once you graduate, now you're like out in the sea on your own, and you just figure it out and see where the current takes you. It was a really bewildering experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone's nodding. And I mean, it was certainly very, very difficult. And I'm sure you've heard of like the adjunct situation with the academic job market.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And it was, I think it's a horrible situation, and I think that academia needs to be, I don't know, it needs to be revolutionized. Like something needs to change, because the current state is not sustainable. And I still have a lot of friends who are, in academia and higher education. So I hear these stories all the time.
Yep.
But I made the decision early on that I was going to, that was not for me, and that I wanted to leave, wanted to do something that was different. And yeah, and I think Penelope's skepticism about academia is very much my own. That there is this, it's kind of self-enclosed in many ways, and and I think the experience of being on the job market, looking for adjunct positions, is very, very different from being in graduate school, and yeah, I felt disillusioned, at least, yeah.
Totally. And I think like, so I have some friends who are currently doing the adjunct thing now. But I think like what happened to me is like, after I made the decision, well, I'm not going to go into academia, it then leads you to a place of like, well, then what do I do with all this stuff that's like banging around in my brain now? Like, now that I have all this like time and effort that I've spent on analysis and, reading critical texts or whatever, it then becomes like, well, where does that all go? And I think maybe what Phil is saying is like, in some ways, I'm reading landscapes and I'm like, this is someone who went through those classes,
Yes.
baby. This is someone who's like seen the dark side and is like trying to like make sense of it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I try to recycle some of my research materials so they wouldn't go to waste. But I also felt like, I didn't want things to just like disappear. But yeah, it is really hard, and I really respect friends who are, still going through the system and trying to fight it in every way that they can. Let's hope it changes.
Is there something we haven't asked you about, your novel or your practice, or what's going on with you right now that you want to say?
I don't know. Yeah, I'm working on something new, which is very exciting. I've already mentioned that, and it's also something that engages with images, with photography specifically. So yeah, so I'm very excited about that. And I am hoping to write some essays as well. This is really to do with art, but just kind of different, just exploring something different. I find it quite hard to write personal essays, just because I don't know. It just that process of saying something personal is quite daunting to me. But that's a challenge I'd like to kind of set for myself sometime in the future.
Well, thanks so much for coming on. I mean, I really loved reading through Landscapes, and I think it was a perfect text for me right now, because this novel that I'm working on, it kind of does some weird formal things, and it gave me a lot of inspiration to think about solving some of the issues that I'm having. So, I really loved hearing like your perspective on the book, and it's a really beautiful book. So I really appreciate you taking the time to come talk with us. And that was our conversation with Christine Lai about her debut novel, Landscapes, from $2 Radio. This book was really interesting to me. You know, I think I came in thinking it'd be one thing, and then, you know, reading the book, you realize that it's just so many different things kind of collaging into this work that's a little bit hard to parse, a little bit challenging, but has so many kind of interesting facets throughout. I'm curious for you, Ben, like what were some things that really stuck out to you with the book and the conversation?
Yeah, I feel like, you know, I guess just like first off, the thing that you and I immediately were like, we're going to love this novel is, you know, initially it seemed like this was a book that was about like art at the end of the world, which is a thing that I think looking back, I'm like, oh, we talk about that a lot. Like that sure do be a theme that we love coming back to, which is like, what does it mean to make art if all of the, you know, trappings of society are going away? And how does that art going to continue to resonate, or how does it resonate when so many things that it's like built around it are gone? And I think the first couple of chapters of this book are kind of interested in that. We've got an archivist who is like looking at some of these pieces of art and trying to preserve them as the world is like changing and dealing with all these different climate disasters. But as the novel goes on, I think it becomes more of a novel about, you know, our relationship to art writ large, and like what it means to connect with a piece of art, and how art in some ways can be a way of like processing trauma or processing these other ways of feeling. But I still think that, like, again, like in a lot of ways that like first conversation around art, and maybe even the second one that show up in this novel, are things that really stuck with me. One of the parts that you and I kind of talked about, I think, before we got into this conversation was, you know, there's an idea in here about, is art for everyone, or is, you know, the best kind of art something that's like hyper personal and kind of impermanent? There's this whole idea of like art can't really stick around. There's a whole conversation in here about like books, and the idea that like when you start reading books and handling the physical copy of a book, it deteriorates. And so there's only X number of times that you can read that book before it becomes unreadable. And that like engaging with art in some ways is very similar, that there's like only so many times that you can like look at a painting, and the act of like having the painting out, it's going to degrade over time. And that at some point, like art is lost and like it stops being available to people. And what does that mean? And so I think that stuff is stuff that you and I talk about all the time outside of this podcast. But I think it's just like something that really resonates.
Yeah, I 100% fuck with all that. You know, similar to you, I think when I started the novel, you know, because I could be misremembering, but my feeling of the first couple pages of the novel was very kind of like, you know, obviously post-apocalyptic, but kind of like almost medieval, which was interesting given that it takes place in the future. And like, you know, the main character was like in a kind of decaying abbey, but in like writing by candlelight, I want to say it, or at least it had that vibe. And I was like, whoa, this isn't what I was expecting. It kind of reminded me like of a video game, or like Dark Souls, or, you know, that kind of brooding quality. You know, ultimately the novel kind of goes in a different direction. But I ended up finding other things that I really appreciated with what Lai does in the novel. And I don't know if I kind of conveyed this appreciation well in the conversation, because like I don't know if we recorded this part, but Christine and I joked right before we started, like, oh, we both were getting kind of sick. So like during the conversation, I don't know if I was fully, you know, my best self asking questions, but something that I really appreciated with what Landscapes does and what Lai does is with the main character. I just like, there's like a really layered feeling to the interiority of the main character. I really like how something that I've grown to appreciate a lot in novels and writing is kind of bringing in this, you know, the cerebral or the dream state into the narrator's life and how that kind of can be disruptive to how you navigate the world. That's something that I kind of want to try to incorporate more. And like reader or listeners, I've seen some of Ben's writing, and I think Ben does this pretty well, like kind of incorporating dreams into, interacting with his characters in really interesting ways. I think Christine Lai also does that in a really interesting and layered way that kind of is very easy to admire throughout the novel.
Yeah, and the dreams I think work really well. The other thing that I think like the dreams are doing something similar to, Lai will describe a painting, and sometimes I think like especially the protagonists, emotional states are not always like right at the surface. You don't have like always the clearest idea of like, well, what is the thing that is kind of driving, some of the actions that she's taking. But you'll literally interspersed, sometimes directly in the text, or sometimes there'll be like a second like italicized, section of the book will just be a description of a handful of paintings. That will usually have a common theme. And I think that stuff just like works really, really well, where sometimes like stuff is not at the surface, but then you get a description of a painting and you're like, oh, this is what this is like actually about right now. And I found that stuff like really cool, really smart. It's like a great way to incorporate this. And Phil and I were kind of talking about how much time we spent like kind of like Googling some of these paintings. And there's something that just like really effective about like, you're like reading this, you're imagining it, and then you pull it up and you're like, oh yeah, like that hits different. And there's something about that like multi medium work that I just really love.
Yeah, and I think also just in general, the novel does a lot of kind of experimentation in terms of form. You get these kind of journal, epistolary kind of things. You get a traditional third-person narrative. You get art criticism essays. You get archival descriptions. It's just experimenting with so many different types of writing, which I'm always like, when I read these kinds of things, I'm like, damn, how do you even like create this? Like I don't know how you like, write all these separate parts. Like something that Christine, I think, talked about on the show was like, oh, I don't have a lot of time to write. So, I would write on the weekends or when I had time. And that's why the main character's name is escaping me right now. But the main character, her sections are in these journal entries because it's kind of like I only had a couple minutes to write. But I think something that, although she kind of is revealing the magician's trick in terms of how she wrote those sections, I think something that I'm still like trying to fathom is like, okay, you write all those sections, but how do you like come up with the narrative around those? How do you sequence those out in a way that kind of makes the reader feel like they're progressing forward? And I think that she does a really good job of doing that throughout the novel. So that's something that I'm really kind of fascinated by, and something that, I want to try in my own writing. And like, to be honest, I feel like, I don't know about you, Ben, but I kind of found like those moments, the art criticism essays, the descriptions of the paintings, like you said, like those were when I felt like the novel was like at its best. I think there was some aspects that maybe like didn't work as well for me in terms of like the more archival stuff, but that's all to say, I really, really liked just how experimental Lai was with the work, and that's something that it's like very, there's so much you can glean from kind of unpacking what she's doing in all those ways.
Yeah, and I think like it in some ways it kind of has its own, like it feels like it really answers some of the questions of like, I think Lai seems to believe or seems to suggest in this book in some ways that like at the end of the day we will continue to connect with art for long after the situations in which it was created are gone, that we will still be able to look back at old pieces of art and like find something that resonates with us and is personal to us and speaks to us, even if we don't even like really know the moment that it was created in anymore, which is interesting because I think like especially when you start setting things in an apocalypse or like in a big moment where like the world is fundamentally different. I don't know. I've like sometimes increasingly I'm like, is there a moment where we're going to stop being able to like even recognize the conditions in when which this was created, or like the frame of reference will be so totally different. One of the ones that I'm thinking about is like, Moby Dick made in the time of whaling. The science is already outdated, right? I think like all the whales are described as fish, but like what happens if, it's not far off, whales go extinct, and then there's a point where it's like, there's a generation that's like, I don't even understand like half of these references. Like, is that a piece of art that if it survives, people have any kind of connection to, or does it just become something that it's like I can't even understand, what is being described here? And I think, lie in some ways, I'm like, seems to suggest to me that like even in that instance, there's something that we might be able to pull from it and like glean from it and like resonate with, even if the world is completely alien that it's showing us at that point.
Yeah. And, and I think, a scene that I really liked, I want to say it's later in the book, is there's a particular painting that the main character has in her room that if I remember correctly, it's like stolen. And it turns out that it's a recreation. It's not like the original, which, they own a lot of original paintings, but this particular one, they just have this recreation of the painting. And that's kind of how the main character's partner takes it. Like, oh, like it's not the original anyway. Like, it's not that big of a loss. But for the main character, because she had this deep connection, like personal connection to this literal recreation of this painting that she admired, it, there's a different kind of resonance that happens when that's lost that, her partner wouldn't have. And I think that kind of personal connection that we all have to different kinds of art, is something that is kind of just inherent to being human and to, reflecting your own life and experiences back at you. Like, those are all things that are going to exist no matter what happens in the world. And I think in some ways, I really appreciated how Lai showed that aspect, juxtaposed with like these kind of arguments around, who gets to decide which, pieces of art are worth remembering, who gets to decide what goes into the zeitgeist and becomes propped up as like the greats,
the canon, baby.
The canon, like that's so much of what these art criticism essays in the novel are kind of unpacking, and how so much of visual art, the ones that are considered the greats, kind of hinges upon sexual violence and sexual assault against women. So like, obviously the novel's really, really interested in kind of unpacking and making sense of, who gets to prop up art, what art gets to be remembered, right? So I think that for such a short novel, it's like 200 pages maybe, Lai really is able to pack so many different conversations, different feelings and expressions all into one very small package that, you have to like be like, damn, that's quite a feat.
Yeah, no, it's a really smart book that I think, like, again, we're hopefully showing you just like how much is in this that is just hard to pull apart, but is also, and I don't know if this made, I think this might be after we stopped recording, but we were both like, that's that academic disease, baby.
100%. I feel like we kind of had a similar conversation with Josh Sawyer about something really in the same kind of vein. But yeah, it's kind of, when you have that personal experience, it's hard not to see it in that way. Like the book is also kind of unpacking some of those woes. But yeah, I mean, this was a really fun conversation. It was really cool to kind of talk to Christine just as her novel was about to come out. We're releasing this episode a little bit after Landscapes has released. But it was cool to kind of see her at this moment that, you know, a lot is going to be changing. She's already working on the next thing, and kind of, I just like talking to authors at that phase. It's always fun.
Yeah, I think this is maybe the most fun. We've hit a lot of authors who are like later in career, and I'm like, no, hitting people right before that'd be feeling good.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't know, Ben. Is there anything else that you wanted to touch on? If not, I feel like, you know, y'all go read this book. It's good. You know, we'd love to hear other people's thoughts on it, not just ours.
Come talk to us about Art Crit, baby. I'm ready.
Yeah, you can find Landscapes on $2radio.com and wherever else you buy books. If you want to get it at a local bookshop and they don't have it, maybe they can order it for you. Do that instead of getting it on Amazon, you know?
That's the way.
So with that, we will see y'all here on the next episode of Origin Story.
Peace.
Thanks again for checking out the show. If you would like to follow me on Twitter, it is 3D Cisco on Twitter as well as Instagram. And you can follow Ben on Twitter at sad_radio_lad. We wanted to thank Melody Hirsch, who designed all the awesome cover art and design work for the website and the podcast itself. And we wanted to thank Ryan Hopper, who does all the intro and outro music, as well as some of the interstitial stuff you hear in different episodes. If you enjoyed the show, we'd love it if you left a review on iTunes, subscribed on either iTunes or Spotify or wherever else you get your podcasts. Reviews help just get the show in front of more people, and it only takes a couple of minutes. So yeah, if you could do that for us, it'd be greatly appreciated.
You should also visit our website at www.originstory.show. It's a great place to look at all of our episodes. There are full transcripts and a link to our Discord channel where we talk with listeners about everything OS and beyond. There's a lot of posting that goes on in there, so I don't know. If you're into that, come join us. You can also email us at theoriginstorypod@gmail.com. We're always looking for feedback, whether it's ideas for, games that we should play, books that we should read, guests that we should have on the show. Just hit us up with thoughts, feelings. We're always looking for feedback, even if it's that Ben has an annoying voice and you don't want to hear it anymore. I mean, that's totally fine. So write us in. You can also follow us on Twitter at @originstory_ or our Instagram at originstory.show. As always, thanks for listening.